We're going to learn about ghostwriting today, what a ghostwriter does, how to prepare to be a ghostwriter, about contracts, ever so important. We're going to go over recognizing some of the specific elements that editors who hire writers are looking for, such as voice and tone. And we're going to talk about how ghostwriters and other writers for hire are actually hired. You're going to practice coming up with your own pitch. You're going to understand what IP is, and we are going to, obviously, to understand what IP is, we have to learn the process of creating an IP, and we are going to practice, again, writing those pitches based off of just as real writers do. So let's get into it. All right, temperature check. If you had to choose between having fame and having fortune, which would you select? Are you doing it for the applause, or are you doing it for the love of money? What is your motivation? Fame or fortune? Next slide. Thank you. All right, opening lines. TikTok deadline approaching. A 90-year-old man from a different faith, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background than your own is ready to write about his sunset years. You've completed a series of interviews and you've decided to begin the manuscript with a life or death situation your client shared about almost being mauled to death by a pack of dogs that kicked off his life as an influential activist. Begin drafting the first chapter. Go. We'll write for about 5 minutes. All right, so what is a ghostwriter? In short, a ghostwriter is someone who is hired to write a book that someone else will be credited for. So you can kind of, the ghostwriter is not given public recognition for their contributions to the project. So it's pretty much a credit for cash thing, right? Like you're getting paid a little bit more than you would had your name been placed on the book as, let's say, a co-author, but you don't receive that sort of fame or recognition. The skills that it takes to be a ghostwriter really kind of comes down to being a highly competent writer, a reporter, a little bit of being a shrink, because you have to manage your clients, and you have to be a bit of an impressionist as well, because there's a lot of mimicking that goes on. A lot of people, are a little bit curious, is ghostwriting legal? Absolutely. The ideas and knowledge contained in the copy typically come from the publicly named author. So you're being hired to execute on someone else's ideas, and you're turning those ideas into words because that's what you're good at. You work closely with your clients, and the goal is to really convey your client's tone, the author's tone, into a finished project or product. So essentially, the ghostwriter is offering a service similar to an editor. So you're just realizing an expressed vision. So very much legal. Yeah. And then is it ethical though? Because this is it can be a little bit of a hot topic. Some people feel like there's an unspoken contract between reader and author that this person wrote the book. That's not necessarily the case. It is accepted as an ethical practice within the publishing industry. It's been around for a long time. I will flag in higher education that obviously is a different matter altogether, where it is considered unethical. And I don't believe it's illegal, but there can be legal ramifications that can arise from academic ghostwriting, primarily against the client, because you're earning grades, degrees, things of that matter. All right, so what's the secret? I don't know. It's kind of a well-known secret. It's been around since royalty. We're thinking back at least to 5th century BC. I mean, if you were royalty, would you be writing everything, or would you just have a scribe do it? I'd probably have a scribe do it personally. And a more contemporary example is Alexander Hamilton. I know a lot of people have seen Hamilton on Broadway, and we've all learned that Alexander Hamilton was a ghostwriter for George Washington. And he's probably, not only was he the politician, the lawyer, the founding father, the founder of our American monetary system, Coast Guard, all the Manumission Society, all these things. He was a ghostwriter, and probably America's greatest, and perhaps even one of the world's greatest. And he's a really good example that you have to be more than a writer, right? Like, Alexander Hamilton would not have been able to write the things he wrote without being a scholar and a statesman and a free thinker. And everyone who has expressed themselves as a talented writer. And there's a lot of power in that. And again, Hamilton's an example. John F. Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Profiles in Courage, which helped him when the presidency was actually ghostwritten, wasn't discovered until years later. And even Mark Twain ghost wrote for President Grant. So been around a while. I won't geek out on this. I can become a little bit of a geek when it comes to history. So we'll keep it moving. Next slide, please. So and then of course there's Nancy Drew, which that information was included on our event page. So you probably already read about it. But Nancy Drew books are written by a team under a made-up name. So yesterday, today, tomorrow, ghostwriters are in high demand. And in fact, by admission of some traditional publishing houses, it's estimated that approximately 70% of books published by large presses are written by ghostwriters. And over 90% of books published by, your artists, your celebrities, your politicians, are written with the help of Ghost. And, and I also want to just flag, it's not about thinking of these huge projects, especially if you're trying to break into ghostwriting. You can also just think about executives, attorneys, financial advisors, even professors who are looking to publish. Maybe they want to expand their platforms, brand themselves as an expert, and they don't have the time or, quite frankly, the ability to write their own manuscripts. Enter the ghostwriter, and that's a fantastic way of sort of breaking into the field. All right, so what does ghostwriting entail? It entails a lot, but in short, interviewing the client, that's definitely, it's paramount, because the most important part of ghostwriting is understanding the material you're writing about and being able to achieve the voice of the author. So before agreeing to the job, it's essential to talk to potential clients to discuss the topic in depth. It'll also give you a sense of their expectations and the scope and vision of the project, which will then inform the contract and how much you are going to demand to be paid. And then, of course, reading the client's assets and social media posts. And that really sort of feeds into understanding who you're working with, right? Because you can't spend 24 hours with them. So you got to think of this person as a family member, where, part of being family is sometimes checking out your family members' Facebook pages or social media pages, even when you're not speaking with them. I have a cousin I haven't spoken to in years, and every now and then I just pop in and see how she's doing. So you're doing some of that because you need to get to know your client so that you can achieve the product that you are setting out to achieve. And then ultimately you're drafting the piece, right? So it's either an article, it could be a story, a blog post, a book, and you're doing it in your client's voice. So you're drafting, you're revising, and you're polishing alongside your client so that it sounds like them. And that's how you will be spending most of your time. It is a mimicking that takes place, and that is an art that requires great practice. But if you can master that, you can always find work. And each piece that you write should have a distinct style and tone. And, I just want to, and another big part of it is just spending time with your clients. So if it's, going out to eat, if it's meeting them in their hometown and going to some of their family members' homes, if it's taking walks at the park, if it's meeting over coffee, these are the things that you really need to do to get to know your client and their voice. All right, I think I went over a lot of this, but I will just add, yeah, I kind of did. If you're facing challenges, just spend more time with them. It's like any relationship, right? You've got to spend time with the person. And when you are working on a project, especially a longer project, you are in a relationship with them, and it does require quality time. Let's see, I can barely read this myself. Oh, revisions. Okay, it's maybe because subconsciously I'm getting a little triggered by revisions, because that is a big part of the process. You need to elicit useful feedback. So you need to find out from your client or to discern, like, does this sound like something the client would write? Are there any words that you should avoid? Are there any words that you should employ? Is this the tone of your client? And these are the questions to ask your client, right? Like, do you think the length is okay? Am I speaking to the right audience? How would you write this differently? Your client will review and make edits, and you'll continue to provide revisions and drafts to ensure that you're headed in the right direction. And so you got to figure out, do I need to pivot? Do I need to continue forward? And you have to pay attention to those edits. Is it the subject matter that they keep editing? Is it the characters? Is it the voice? Do you have the right theme? And you're getting closer to the finish line when their edits are on the decrease. So that means your voice, your ideas, the presentation, the conventions, the organization, the word choice, and the sentence fluency are all on point. And one thing that I would often do is just sort of like read aloud and kind of like mimic the person's voice. And if it sounds like them, then I'm doing well. If it doesn't, then maybe Margery's creeping in a little bit and I need to pull her back. So a big part of it is just like any writing is getting out of the way of the characters. And in this case, your character is actually a living person. If you're writing memoir. Fiction's a little bit different. Fiction is the same convictions of writing fiction, but if you are working with an editor, at the end of the day, and I believe Kat will go into this a little bit more as well. At the end of the day, you are there to please your client. So you're still kind of working within that framework and needing that feedback to make sure you're not wasting your time and you're headed in the right direction. Okay. I just said that, headed in the right direction. So, and just paying close attention. Communication is ever so important. Reviewing the edits is super important. And, elicit that feedback. Okay, the contract. Now, this seems very, very dry, right? Because it's like creative writing and then there's contracts. But the contract is very important. And I'm going to try to go through contracts as quickly as possible, starting with the name, your name, the name of your company, the name of the client, obviously, and the roles. So within a ghostwriting contract, you're the ghostwriter, your client is the author. You need to go over the division of labor. Who's responsible for doing what? Is the client going to provide interviews, notes, data research, other material? And if so, by when? By when is key because you will have a deadline within your contract. And you need to ensure that you protect yourself by giving your clients deadlines, turnaround time deadlines, right? Like when they have to get you what? When do they have to give you your feedback? When do they have to give you the documents you need to actually write what you need to write? It's very important that all of that is described in detail within the contract. Detail is key. So for instance, if you request information from the author, then, you can include requested documents will be provided within 72 hours via email. That's an example. So obviously the effective date of the contract, the milestone due dates, the asset due dates, the interviews, copies, documents, reviews. And this is really the first set, the client asset due dates, very important because you're going to really need that to get started. And then of course, there are the ghostwriters due dates. So it's the completion of the outline. It's the sample chapters. It's the first half of the first draft. It's the completion of the first draft. It's the final manuscript. It's revision turnaround time. And of course, payment is connected to these milestones typically. And you want to make sure you give yourself enough time to produce high quality drafts while meeting all your deadlines. Do not set yourself up for failure. If you have a potential client and the money's looking really good, but you don't have the time, it is better to walk away. The number one way to sort of be iced out of ghostwriting is to not meet your deadlines. And the number one way to have a steady stream of clients is to write well and meet your deadlines. So very, very, very specific on the projects that you take on. And of course, writers, we need time to write. So like, you're going to have to take a walk in the park and watch the squirrels every now and then because you have to process things yourself. So it's not just paying yourself for the writing, but just the processing and everything else that you have to do. All right, because I'm going to give you an example of what you don't want to happen. Hit play, please.
Dive, dive, yelled the captain through the thing. So the man who makes it dive pressed a button or something, and it dove. And the enemy was foiled again. Looks like we foiled them again, said Dave. Yeah, said the captain. We foiled those bastards again, didn't we, Dave? Yeah, said Dave. The end.
Okay.
Okay, and your client's not just going to say okay and hand over the check. This is an extremely funny clip to me because I've been there, final hour, and having to produce something. And while you can never underestimate the power of your favorite cookie, unlimited coffee or tea, an Oxford dictionary, and thesaurus, you still have to know when not to take on a project because you will be suffering and pulling all-nighters. And at the end of the day, you want to produce quality work and you don't want to produce what the lady in the clip produced. All right, money, money, money. So we want the fortune, right? As I mentioned previously, payment is, in my case, it was always connected with deliverables outside of revisions, and it's paid ahead of writing. So payment for each deliverable can be broken up according to the price. So for example, if you're charging $60,000, you have 5 milestones. The compensation for each segment would be $12,000. If you're charging for both the work you do and the time, oh yes, please, as I mentioned before, you are charging for both the work you do and the time it takes to execute. So just don't sell yourself short. Charge for your time. It's not just charging for the time you're sitting there actually typing the words. You're going to have to do interviews. You may have to travel. And speaking of traveling, that's another consideration. You need to include in your contract who's paying for travel, should that be necessary. Who's paying for meals if you're meeting for dinner. If you're going to a conference to see them speak. Who's paying for these things. So make sure that you highlight all of that. There are 3 basic modes of payment, of billing, which is hourly, by word, or by project. And most, ghostwriting clients really prefer to pay a flat fee for the entire project. So just, again, making sure that you know what you're committing to before you say yes is super important. And then what you can charge is based on your experience, right? So if you're getting started, you may not walk in, demanding, $100,000 for 50,000 word project. That may not happen. There is a part of it where you kind of have to pay your dues a little bit. And that doesn't mean selling yourself short. What that means is maybe taking on smaller projects initially until you have built up the agility to handle larger projects. Because if you sell yourself short, then you have to think about what is your motivation. The temperature check, do you want the fame or the fortune? Everyone who responded said fortune, and money does motivate. So you want to make sure that you have something, a little carrot dangling in front of you that you keep striving for in order to finish these projects. But so there's a pretty large gap here. It could be from 10,000 to 50,000 for both fiction and nonfiction books. Sometimes you are paid, $10,000 for very short books, children's books. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can make money in ghostwriting, but you really have to brand yourself as an expert and get that experience. And as you advance, so do your prices. So some people do prefer to charge by the hour. So that could be $30 to $200 per hour. You're looking at $1 to $3 per word, very attainable. And $60,000 for, between $50,000 and $70,000 is attainable as well. And because you're not getting any credit, again, that's where your cash comes in. And ghostwriters do not receive royalties. So that's sort of the catch-22, right? If you're writing a bestseller and you thought you did well because you cashed out 100K, 100,000, if this goes on to make, I don't know, 10 million, then sometimes you're kind of left feeling like you have a little bit of pie on your face, but that's okay. It just means you're going to be receiving more jobs. And you also have sort of perfected how to deliver in a shorter time span. So your earning potential just increases. But I will admit that sometimes you can be left feeling like, wow, yeah, I did that and I got this. So but then sometimes here's the flip side to that is if you are working for a client who is an individual and say you make $50,000, And the book doesn't really do that great. I mean, it's not a fantastic notch on your belt, but you're not responsible for marketing, right? You've done your bit and you've gotten paid and you can move on to your next client. So it all sort of pans out in the real world. All right, the length. Your contract definitely needs to specify how many words you're expected to write. Go by the words, not by the pages. We all know, font size, style, space, those are all variables. And there's an example here on the screen, as well as in your lesson plan, on how to word that. And then, of course, I already touched upon expenses, so make sure to include that. All right, copyright, you don't own it. It's not yours. You're not the author. So you've sold out. You've taken your credit for cash, and so you're moving right along. An indemnification clause needs to be included, and that so that basically, if because there's different levels of ghostwriting. So say your client provides a couple of paragraphs or whatnot. I mean, what if they plagiarize those? Wasn't me, right? Like, all of my work was original. So you need to make sure you include that so that you're protected as the ghostwriter. And likewise, you also include in the contract that all work that you provide is original as well. Confidentiality, this is a big one. You just have to keep your mouth shut and you have to include it in the contract. And you also need to protect yourself, right? You want to on both sides, right? So there's non-disclosure. Typically, if you're working for a company, they will provide the contract if you're working for a company. And oftentimes if you're working for a celebrity, there's also a separate NDA that they provide, but you also want to include it in your contract. And there's an example of language on the screen. And then, of course, credit. This sort of protects your client and you. Like, if you want to be listed in the acknowledgements, you can. But think about it though. Like, you got to think about whether or not you want to be associated with the project. I know personally, I've done some projects where I did not want to be listed on the acknowledgements, and that wasn't a sign of my writing ability. It was more of a sign of not wanting to be associated with specific, person. All right, termination. So you need to protect yourself by including a kill fee. I just spent 2 months working on this book and this person wants to flake out. And I left money on the table, right, with other people. I didn't take on their jobs, or I didn't take on those projects because I have dedicated my self to this project. So protect yourself, include a kill fee. There's an example on the screen. And then you can also include that the author provided testimonial that you can show future clients, because you are bound by confidentiality. But referrals are important, right? This is very much a word of mouth business. And so this is one way to just showcase what you've done by including a little referral clause. And our lovely, lovely revisions. So you really must highlight how many revisions are allowed. And 2 is a good standard. The last thing that you need is to, go through 2 revisions, look at all the notes, everything's great, then something happens and more revisions are needed. And sometimes it happens, like, it can be a natural thing. Sometimes things shift, or, people get different ideas. And after those 2 revisions, you need to charge additional fees for any further revisions. So make sure you include that, and also set the expectation. Let them know those first drafts, there's going to be typos, there's going to be some grammatical errors. That's mild stuff. And I mean revisions, you're talking about like structural revisions. So yeah, just setting the expectation and highlighting what's covered when, and if more needs to be covered, what that looks like, financially speaking, and timeline speaking as well. So let's say my client is coming to visit me. Where is she?
Margery.
Oh, hi. How do you do?
Hi, we have a problem.
Oh, what would that be?
Well, I let my friends read the manuscript and they all recognized themselves. And remember, when we spoke, they were not supposed to be able to recognize themselves, and they do. That's a problem. Now, what
Well,
are we going to do about that?
Well, I'm so sorry to hear that. We had talked about the scenes that are included in the book.
Mhm.
You did approve these scenes.
Mhm.
You provided notes. I made all the requested revisions.
Well, it's not working, is it? It's not. Because they see themselves and they're not happy with how they see themselves. They are not happy with how they appear on the page. So I think we need to do another rewrite, right?
Well, we certainly can. Now, I have already provided 2 revisions that you approved. So we definitely need to have a conversation about what we want to include this time around, a timeline and a payment scale. And
A
so I
payment?
can, yes,
What
yes.
does that mean? What do you mean a payment?
That means you have 2 revisions that were included in your contract that have been provided.
Uh-huh.
So any further revisions, we would have to revisit pay scale, and that would require further payment.
Oh, Margery, I don't think so, because I'm not satisfied. The revision isn't right. It's not what we discussed, is it? Do you want to work again in this town? Because I know a lot of people.
Absolutely, I definitely want to work in this town. Now, I feel like we're at an impasse, and I really do want this to work. So really the options would be for us to have a conversation. It sounds like this book needs to go in a different direction, although I really think you have something fantastic here. And maybe that's why they are responding the way they are responding. However, if it can't work, I'd hate to say, I mean, we're at the end of the road. I've done the work. This is the final draft. You've already been granted 2 revisions. Um, and I'm not sure what you're saying to me about working in this town again. But I have fulfilled all of the contractual obligations. And being that's the case, we are both bound by a confidentiality agreement. And um, in fact, you actually did agree to provide a referral, but that's okay. I'm not going to request that of you.
Look, Margery, look, you came very highly recommended, and I trusted that source. And I trust you that you can do this. I do not want to have to find someone again, but I do want this work to reflect well on the people who are in this book. So what can we do?
It sounds like you want to write a new book.
No, I do not want to write a new book. I want this book to be the book we talked about.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you sit with your thoughts, think about new emerging characters, themes, what you really want to say. Your friends were such a big part of this book, and you were very specific about including certain scenes and experiences. So I want you to think about it, shoot me an email. I really want to work this out. I cannot provide any other revisions to this book. The book is pretty much complete, but we can have a conversation and try to work this out.
Okay, I'll think about it. Now, what happens if I do decide to go with someone else?
Then I mean, I will be sending you a final bill, and I look forward to receiving payment.
For the final bill? Mhm.
Yes, since the work is done, we don't have to worry about a kill fee.
What's the kill fee again?
Well, you did agree, if we mutually agree to terminate this project, you would pay a kill fee of $5,500. But at this point, we are at the end of the project. So I will
Okay.
send you a bill for the final.
Okay, well, I'm a humanist and I don't want to kill anything. So why don't we work this out? I do like your work, Margery. I do like your work very much. I just don't want anybody to be upset by this. You can understand that, right?
I can, but I want you to reflect on how your book is your story. And
Mm.
sometimes you are bringing things up and people that you know and love, and it's difficult for them, but in the long run, it may be helpful. So I want you to think about how this book could possibly help your friends.
Huh. Okay, that's an interesting take on it. You know what? I am going to think about that. and I'll get back to you. Thank
Thank
you, Margery.
Thank you, Erica.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Give it up for Erica's acting chops. So this would have been a lot more nerve-wracking if there were no stipulations within the contract to protect the ghostwriter, right? It's like, I want to stop. And it's like, well, okay, there's a kill fee, there's confidentiality. So I'm not that nervous. I know that I've connected with this person. I know that this person has a desire to express something in a book. So there's a little bit of psychology there. There's a lot of contract protection. And there's the human connection, right? We've spent time together, so I know this person a little bit. But that does sort of highlight the importance of contracts and spending time with your clients. So, and pro tip, get to know the client's inner circle before committing to the project to assess any potential meddling. And you can also set boundaries in the contract. So for instance, I won't be making any changes beyond, what is requested by the author and what is contracted in writing. You definitely do see lovely family members and friends who have a lot to say about manuscripts. So, it'd be nice to include not sharing the manuscript with anyone until it's complete, but that might be taken a little bit too far. All right, so I'm going to very quickly just go over how you can get started in ghostwriting. First things first, to be a good writer, of course, you have to be a good reader. So read broadly on a variety of topics. It's critical, especially paramount for ghostwriters, because you've got to write in a variety of styles and tones in order to meet clients' desires. So the more you read, the more you'll understand the structural components that make for good narratives. And then you'll also understand greater the tenets of regular grammar convictions, how other authors tackle various topics. And these are all key in developing the competencies needed to approach subject matter in a unique way, because everything that you submit, it has to be original. So that's a lot of creativity and you have to stay inspired. So read. And then up next, pay your dues. I mentioned this previously. Think about smaller pieces. You're freelancing, right? So blog posts, magazine articles, short guides, manuals for small organizations, social media copy. You can do all kinds of things. Just get your feet wet, start putting your stuff out there, and offer yourself up, and you'll start carving a name out for yourself. And you'll also more than likely sort of develop a niche. And then, of course, you are going to practice writing in other styles and voices. So lots of mimicking. You all did it a little bit today, just writing from a different perspective. And you can practice this by, like, I don't know, say your friend's been needing to send this work email forever and they're so worried about it. Help your friend out. Write the email. Write a blog update about your friend's latest trip. If you have a sibling that travels all the time, write their Facebook post. My sister, she travels and she has these long, I tell her she needs a travel blog. She has these long, narratives with her photos. If you have someone like that, write the narratives for them. And then record yourself reading something aloud and then transcribing it. This will help you get used to hearing different voices and figuring out how to capture them on the page. Write first-person fiction with a protagonist who is different than you, and have it workshopped. And then, of course, attend Girls Write Now workshops and salons and respond to the writing prompts from a unique angle. And then flesh your responses out on your own time. And then last but not least, this is where your marketing comes in. You don't have to market the books. Like, that's a big part of like an author's responsibility is marketing books, but you do have to market yourself and build credibility. Once you really build that credibility, it's minimal marketing. So you can do that by posting, work on comments on LinkedIn, self-publishing, start a blog, just put your work out there for people to see. And then you'll find that people will begin endorsing you. You'll also build up your portfolio so that you have samples ready when requested. And your portfolio should have many different writing styles. So that's a quick tips to get started in ghostwriting. I'm handing the floor to you. Thank you, Kat.
Yeah, I am Kat. I work at Alloy Entertainment in IP, and we make books, television, and TV. So I'm going to talk to you about IP, which I will tell you what that is, but it stands for intellectual property. And I'm going to talk about the process of that from the pitch all the way to publication. So we're going to start off with a writing prompt. So this is an example of a pitch. And the pitch is for a YA retelling of Romeo and Juliet. So you're imagining that you're a ghostwriter who's been hired to write this novel. And the pitch, I will read the prompt. Juliet is not having a good week. All she wanted was to avoid marriage to that pompous Count Paris. At first, her plan is simple: be seen in public with her cousin Rosalind's flirty boyfriend, Romeo Montague, thus starting just enough of a scandal to convince Count Paris to withdraw his proposal. It should have been easy, but she didn't count on her hot-headed cousin Tybalt sticking his nose in where it didn't belong. Now Paris's cousin Mercutio is dead, and if Tybalt's not careful, soon he will be too, by Romeo's own hand. To make matters worse, Romeo is completely obsessed with her, and her favorite cousin Rosalind has accused her of stealing her man. What's a young Capulet to do? Juliet just wanted to cause a scandal. She isn't interested in destroying her honor and her family. She'll have to think of a way out of this mess, and soon, before she too ends up dead. So you can decide how you want to make this book, but start your opening sentence and see where it takes you. What was IP anyway? What you just wrote off was IP. So IP stands for intellectual property, which refers to ideas as property that can be owned, monetized, copyrighted, and or trademarked. This is a kind of hefty corporate definition. So to use sort of more layman's terms, I like to think of IP as the economy of ideas and how you can get paid for them. So going back to Fortune, right? IP within the creative field of books can include characters, it can include worlds like Game of Thrones, it can include fantastical creatures like J.K. Rowling's like Niffler, it can include unique systems of magic like in N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, anything that if someone else decided to use for their own book, someone could point out and say, hey, they stole that from, you know, N.K. Jemisin or whatever author it is. So it's meant to protect both companies and artists from intellectual theft. So some IP you might recognize would be Barbie, Mickey Mouse, Nightmare Before Christmas, Black Panther, Vampire Diaries, Spiderwick Chronicles, anything like that. So each company has their own process, but generally IP is created in-house for our purposes. So that means a company like Marvel or Disney or Mattel or Warner Brothers, or now Warner Brothers Discovery, and even traditional publishing houses like Clarion or you know, Random House might come up with an idea either based on an existing character or something, you know, entirely new. And from there, an in-house editor will come up with a pitch like the one you just wrote off of. So as I sort of mentioned before, anyone can create IP. So any author who has a property or a book that's been published, that's IP. But for our purposes, we're talking about IP where they would be looking for writers to hire. So in the right for hire space for ghostwriters or for co-authors or authors. And that's the IP that was outlined above. So to break this down into some specific examples, because I think it makes it easier to understand, the Vampire Diaries is IP that is owned by the company that I work for. And there's the original book series that was then turned into a show. And that IP has been used and reused in spin-off shows such as Legacies. So that would be an example where that IP is like an existing character world that's being reused again and again. You can also take the characters and make brand new books. So for example, I could go into my boss's office and say, I want to write a middle grade book based on Damon and Stefan growing up and their vampiric boyhood adventures. And so we could create new IP based on something that already exists. Another option is to create completely new IP. So I can go in and say, I think I have the next big thing. It's going to be a battle royale YA set in space with teenagers who ride space monsters. And the comps, which are titles or properties you compare them to, would be Hunger Games meets Squid Game meets Dragons of Pern. And my boss would be like, that's a terrible idea, because it kind of is. But you get the idea. You can just come up anything that you can come up with that you think that you can sell as IP. So the pitching process. So an editor or creative director, depending on what your title is, depends on what your company is, must get their idea approved by their company before they can find an author. And this usually means that the pitch goes through several iterations. From a business perspective, this mostly means that your company is looking for a few things. So audience is a big part of it. Who's this for? Is this for middle grade? Is this for adult? Is this for, rural parts of America? Is this for cities? This can be a bit arbitrary. If we think about how many adults have read Twilight or how many teenagers love Colleen Hoover right now, there's something called crossover appeal in the industry. So people outside of the intended audience might read something no matter who it's supposed to be for. Some people will try to aim for this. It's very tricky. Because if you write something, for example, that's too mature, you run the risk of libraries and schools not accepting it. So there's always the conversation of how you get things past gatekeepers. Scope, can we make this broader so more people want to read or watch it? Do we narrow the idea down so it doesn't feel generic? My boss often says the more specific a story is, the broader it feels, which means that if it's a story about a very specific character and that person feels really real, then you're reading about someone you're getting to know them, even though, you know, the actual story that you're reading may be about, you know, someone who makes glass beads in a small town you've never heard of and has a very different, you know, job from you. As long as the story is compelling, it doesn't matter. Salability. Is this good for today's market? Historical romance, for example, is really in right now, or like, you know, reimaginings of classic characters with a feminist bent, like the pitch I just had you guys write off in the beginning, is very in right now, but will that kind of story have longevity? And there's also the question of, does that matter? It's kind of a complex issue. Generally, companies don't like to chase trends, but also you want your like book to do well in the market. So it kind of becomes like a balance of like, how much do we want this book to like be in, and how much do we want to like try to be the trendsetter instead of the trend follower? Something that's not on here also, but really matters to certain companies, I think more than others, is, does this have series potential? How many books, movies, etc. can we get out of this? I didn't put this on the slide because it matters less at places I've worked, but I want to include it because for a company like, say, Mattel or Disney, that might be what they care about. How many toys, books, movies, TV shows can we get out of this idea? And finally, and most importantly, there's story. So what is the hook? Do we care about these characters? What makes someone want to read this? That's the most important question, and it totally eclipses everything else that I just said. So if you have a really good story, none of the rest of that matters. It is very rare that that happens, I will say, but I'm sure everyone on this Zoom has read a book where, even though the writing wasn't great, the story was so interesting or the characters were so interesting that it kept you going. So similarly, in the publishing biz, if you have a really good idea, you can probably sell it no matter what. So how do writers get hired? So once a pitch has been greenlit, which is sort of the industry talk for, you know, all the powers that be say this is a great idea, it's time to hire a writer. And this is where the editorial team decides if they want to hire a ghostwriter or if they want to hire a writer for hire who's going to actually put their name on the book, be the face of their new IP, etc. And there are pros and cons to this, which is, Margery touched on this a little bit earlier, but when you're a ghostwriter, you don't get royalties, and when you are on the book, you do. But from the editor perspective, there are also pros and cons. So for example, hiring a ghostwriter allows a company to maintain total control of the project. They don't have to argue with somebody about, oh, well, I want things to be a certain way or the other, whatever, you know, Disney decides is what Disney decides. But it can be really beneficial on the other side to have an author that fans can interact with, someone who can do interviews, who can do book signings, who can go on Sesame Street and, you know, be nominated for awards. So ultimately, this decision is different for every company and sometimes for every project. So if you have something that you think is going to be more literary and has the potential to like do very well and win a lot of awards, you might want someone attached to it so that, you know, you can be nominated for certain things. But if it's like a serialized book for, you know, a TV show, for example, if you're writing a book that's based off of like, you know, Dora the Explorer, having an author attached to that is not as important for the fans because they care more about Dora the Explorer than they do about this hypothetical person, right? Another common time to hire a ghostwriter is like towards the end of a series. If an author has like made it big and signed up for a bunch of other projects and is crunched for time. So a ghostwriter might like read all of the books in the series, so they have a lot of material to base their writing off of, and then, you know, finish the last few books, and then the author goes back and does what's called a voice pass, which is where they go through the book and they make sure everything is as they wanted, and they make all of the language sound a little bit more like them. So yeah, there are different ways to do it. It all depends on the project. So once a few people try their hand at writing a pitch, usually as an editor, you send it out to a few different authors and you get sample pages. Usually the editor, the development team behind the project will look at those samples and then they'll decide who they want to hire based off of them. So there are a lot of things that go into that decision. And I would say these are what I think the most important are. So first is voice, which Margery talked about a little bit. So a writer for hire has to write in the voice that matches the editor or company's vision. Do they feel the characters? Do they feel alive? Does the reader have a clear sense of who the narrator is? what the main character wants, what drives them. Voice frequently can make or break a piece. A timely example is Bridgerton. The plot for Bridgerton is basically Gossip Girl set in a different time. And the voice is like, so it's so iconic that they ended up like hiring Julie Andrews to do it when they did the television show. So voice can really like drive a property and like make it really interesting to people. Tone is separate from voice. And a good example is if a company asks for a rom-com and then the story that comes back is just a straight romance and it's not really funny at all, that writer is probably not a good fit. A really good example of how tone can totally change a piece is Enola Holmes. It's set in a very different world than us and ours, in a time with very archaic and conservative social mores, and the tone of the piece is very modern and feminist. It has a very modern sensibility. And so a fun mismatch like that can really make a story stand out among the pack. Another important thing to consider is positionality. So is this a queer writer writing queer characters? Is this a BIPOC person writing, you know, a character of color? And if it's not, are they a good enough writer to merit them taking the spot of another writer who might be able to write those characters from their lived experiences? I will say there are companies who I will not name who I might refer to as unscrupulous who totally don't care about this at all. The company I work for would probably never hire somebody who doesn't have the right positionality for a book, but not everybody's so discerning. I also don't think it's always unethical. I think that like if the person who, you know, is attached to it, like if you're ghostwriting for someone who is like a queer person of color and you're white and they said it was okay, that's one thing. But I think that if with fiction, it can get a little messy because there's no one who's of that background to advocate for the story potentially, right? So I think that can get a little messier. And then there's writing skill. How's the dialogue? Are the chapter outs, which is how each chapter ends, good? Do they make sense? Are the transitions clean? Are they good at grounding us in a scene, or does it kind of feel like the characters are just floating in space? In my anecdotal experience, these issues matter less. And here's why. It's much harder to find a writer that has a unique voice or a really strong vision for how to execute a pitch or a really unique turn of phrase than it is to fix someone's beginner writer mistakes. Grammar can be taught. Grammar, I can just go in and fix your grammar if it doesn't make any sense. Like, you know what I mean? If you have past and present in the same sentence, I can just fix that. But it's much more difficult for me to really nail a voice or tone if that's not in there. So tone and voice might be teachable to someone in like a, you know, writing program, but it's much harder in a professional relationship to capture that je ne sais quoi, for example. So especially when you're working on deadline. So generally this last one that matters less. Like we'd rather have someone who has a really unique voice and makes like writing mistakes as opposed to someone whose writing is perfect, but they don't have a strong vision for what the piece is going to look like. I will say also one last thing. It's interesting to be talking about writing for hire right now because I think the landscape of publishing is changing very quickly. So a few years ago in like voice acting, voice actors began to be replaced by famous actors in major films, whereas before they were very separate trades. And now we're seeing in a handful of cases, ghostwriters or writers for hire being replaced by established track authors. Like Leigh Bardugo did a Wonder Woman tie-in novel. Shay Earnshaw did The Pumpkin Queen, which was a tie-in novel to Nightmare Before Christmas. So it'll be interesting for me to see whether that trend sort of continues and grows in the next few years. So writer's been hired, and now it's time to plot the book. Every company has a different process. At some companies, they'll just give a writer a plot outline with all the chapters and be like, okay, go do this. Some places just hand a ghostwriter a pitch and they tell them to run with it, and it's sort of their job to put everything together. I will say the more work the ghostwriter is expected to do, the more they'll probably get paid. So like if you're handing them an outline, they have less work to do than if you just hand them an idea and you're like, okay, go run with this. The company I work at likes to work collaboratively and plot with an author, try to build a story that feels exciting to all parties so that we're all sort of on the same page. But every property is unique, and even within each company, there's variation. Writing the book. So this is pretty self-explanatory. A writer goes off, they write the book on their own. She comes back, hopefully it's something good. This is obviously not as easy as this slide makes it sound. Writing is really hard, and writing someone else's story comes with its own challenges. I really want to reemphasize here what Margery said before about the importance of meeting deadlines as an author. That is the only time I've ever had to kill a project, was when an author consistently could not meet deadlines. And then that's because we're talking about the development process, right? But once, you know, the book is partnered with a publishing house and it has a pub date, like we have to make those deadlines because the manuscript has to go to the printer and the printer has to print the book, and then the book has to be shipped to Barnes and Nobles and all these places where it's going to be sold. So if I can't trust someone to meet those deadlines every single time, like even before things get serious, I'd rather not be put in a position where later we're going to be on the hook with all of these other companies that are then going to be looking at my company and being like, how come you didn't manage your editorial calendar correctly? I always tell an author it's better to give me the bad version on time, because that's what revisions are for. Gives me time to fix it, as opposed to turning in something later that you think is better, but it's probably going to have to be edited anyway. So we get a manuscript in, we make the necessary edits. What this looks like looks really different depending on each company. So all editors, because that's what an editor does, will do developmental and line edits. So developmental edits are like, you know, major story things, like, is the romance building in a way that feels satisfying? Are we tracking, you know, so-and-so character's grandma died in the beginning, how is she getting over that grief? Are we tracking all of these sort of arcs in the book, right? And then line edits are like, does this sentence sound good? We can, you know, change this phrasing here, etc. However, when you have pre-existing IP, like say Godzilla or Wonder Woman or Vampire Diaries, anything that, you know, already has been seen by the public and has a lineage, an editor has to consider both the character's brand, the property's brand, and the company's brand. So does the way this character is written feel true to past iterations? Does the story align with Disney or Mattel or whatever's brand identity? And how might existing fans of this IP react to the story that you're writing? So we've all seen fans blow up because they were mad about, for example, like the Zack Snyder, like DC cut like drama. Obviously no company wants to go through that level of Twitter scrutiny. So we're always thinking about, you know, does this match with what these characters are supposed to be? If we're changing things, are we doing it for the right reason? Does it, you know, do interesting things for the story, or is it just going to piss people off and it's not going to be any good? Obviously. I worked with a writer who had previously worked on a tie-in for a major pre-existing IP project, which I cannot say which one, but she told me that she had to send all of her chapters to someone called the lore master, which is a real paid position where they send her edits, such as like, on page 75 of your manuscript, you mentioned that this supervillain does XYZ, but he can't, because in issue 17 of Supervillains of the World, 1987, it says that his powers can't be used for that. So writing for old beloved IP can be really challenging for this reason. And there are even people, depending on the company or the IP, whose job it is to make sure that everything makes sense. Then we go off to market. So once the manuscript is ready, it's been approved by all parties, it's time to send it off to market. For some companies, that means making a deal with a publisher first. And for other companies who have their own distribution processes, like Disney, they have the power to just publish it on their own. So for a company that has to sell the IP, we also function as sort of an agent. So you have to make a list of who you're going to submit to. You have to get all of your editors in line, and you have to figure out, like, okay, for example, there are different publishing houses where you can only submit to a certain number of editors. You have to do research and figure out, okay, there are 3 editors at this publishing house, but we can only submit to one of them. Who do we think is the best person for this book? All of that stuff is stuff that an agent typically does, but when you own the IP and you're an IP company, you frequently are responsible for all of those things as well. And ideally, then you make a deal with a publisher and the book goes to market.
Stay connected with us. Check me out at theliterarypurveyor.com. And Kat is so gracious that they are providing their email address. So you can stay in contact with Kat at kjagai@alloyentertainment.com. Thank you so much for being with us today. And don't forget to follow us on social at Girls Write Now.